Beer is one of the most oldest and widely consumed alcoholic beverages in the world. It is made with natural ingredients and bottled with an incredible speed. So how is beer produced? In today's video, we follow the process of harvesting barley and brewing craft beer. Sometimes there's nothing quite like a nice cold beer, but creating that one-of-a-kind flavour is not easy. Everything starts from the barley fields. Barley is typically grown in temperate climates. In the United States, the northern and western regions are the main barley growing regions. Amongst them, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington are the leading barley producing states. Barley is sown in the spring. At first, it will look like grass. After growing to a height of 30 to 40 centimeters, they will begin to form seeds. Barley growing conditions can vary depending on the cultivator. However, barley grows best at 13 degrees Celsius. Barley harvest time depends on grain moisture and the weather in the field. Barley is ripe and ready to harvest when the grain moisture content ranges from 12.5 to 18%. If the moisture content of the grain is lower, farmers need to take special storage measures if the grain is too wet. Barley is usually harvested using combine harvesters and barley threshers. The barley harvest is handled with particular care. If used to produce malt, the harvest standards are higher. The barley itself needs to be dry so that the combine harvester can easily separate the grain from the straw. Typically, winter barley is harvested in July, and spring barley is harvested in August. After harvest, the barley is brought to this location, where it will be sampled and tested for germination levels and various quality parameters to ensure a top quality product. Producers must consider many factors, including skin adhesion, mold, frost damage, and common plant diseases. After passing the test, the next step is malting. Barley grains after harvest are starchy and have a grassy smell. If you brew beer immediately, the yeast won't be able to access those complex carbohydrates. Therefore, malting is the key process to convert barley into malt and determines the colour, aroma, and flavour of beer. It starts by soaking the barley in water and letting the barley absorb the moisture. After several hours, the water is drained and the seeds are exposed to air. It goes through several stages of moistening and oxidation to activate the workpiece. The soaking process will end when the grain moisture increases to an average of 45%. This usually takes around 3 to 5 days, depending on the type of barley and the environment. Next, during the germination stage, you will see a lot of roots growing, which is a good sign. Starch storage occurs in a process called thermodynamics, and producers must control sprouting to ensure uniform germination. Producers turn the seeds periodically to ensure that the roots are woven together and inhibit airflow through the seeds. The drying process is the final stage, so they conduct drying using warm air. The process begins with the germinated barley being spread out in an oven and heated to the right temperature. Drying is important because it can affect the colour and flavour of the barley and prevent the grain from growing into a plant. The heat will then help dry the barley and also help break down the starch into simpler sugars. Yeast is then used in the fermentation process. The boiler is also a very important part of the process. because it affects the colour and flavour of the malt. Canadian barley is renowned around the world for its high quality, with more than 23,000 farmers producing approximately 8 million tonnes of barley each year. Producers take barley from the fields and it goes through a malting process at the mill. But why was barley chosen to make beer? Barley is the #1 grain used in beer production because it has the right properties. With the explosion in popularity of craft breweries, experimentation with flavors, processes, and ingredients is at an all-time high. Soaking barley is the process of activating enzymes inside the grain. Barley will be poured into the tub, and they are soaked in water and completely saturated. The manufacturer changes the water once a day, every 45 to 72 hours. The seeds are aerated and stirred to germinate, releasing enzymes that convert the starch contained in the seeds into sugars for fermentation. Milling barley is an important step because it increases the surface area of the production process, making the barley more accessible to water. Manufacturing plants often use specialized milling equipment, such as roller mills or hammer mills, to grind barley. Next, the barley is mixed with warm water until it is as thick as mixed porridge. Boiling is an important step in the manufacturing process because it sterilizes, killing any unwanted microorganisms. Depending on the time of boiling, hops are added to increase bitterness. The longer the hops are boiled, the more bitter the beer becomes. Usually hops are added after the boiling process, during the last 15 to 30 minutes, contributing to the flavour. The boiling process usually lasts around 60 to 90 minutes. All this is done inside the kettle. There was 7 to 12 feet in diameter and steam 2 stories high to provide heating power for the kettle. Once the brewing process is complete, the mixture is filtered again and pumped into the fermentation tank. Fermentation is where the magic happens. There are 2 types of fermentation during beer production. These are first stage primary fermentation and secondary fermentation. When yeast is most active, it consumes most of the sugar and creates beer. Beer is packaged in a variety of formats, including bottles and cans. The packaging process is important to preserve quality. Some beers are filtered again to remove any remaining solids and yeast before packaging. Producers also measure factors such as alcohol content, bitterness, pH, and colour. Breweries use a variety of techniques to ensure that their beer is consistent in flavour and overall quality. Kelowna residents are having a great time making craft beer. They have a small brewery space. Although small in scale, every production step is similar to large factories. They work hard to produce quality beer. Having multiple kegs full of beer opens up many opportunities to create many different styles of beer. Kelowna is located at the northern end of the desert, so water scarcity has become a problem for brewers. When using a standard kettle system, a brewer needs 4 to 6 litres of water to make 1 litre of beer. Because the amount of water needed is so much, saving water is important. They can filter and reuse clean water into fermentation tanks to make the next batch of beer. Brewers are conscious and sensitive to the expansion of this agricultural industry. Economic development and environmental friendliness are what they aim for. They use spent grain after the brewing process as animal feed. In the fields and green forests of Japan, farmers produce valuable agricultural products. Their creativity and perseverance not only bring bumper harvests, but also contribute to enhancing the value of Japanese agricultural products in the international market. Let's explore how Japanese farmers harvest thousands of tons of agricultural products. Udo is a wild, edible plant native to various regions of Japan. It has been used as a spring dish since ancient times. Udo is divided into Yama Udo and Nanka Udo. Both grow from early spring to about April. However, the appearance is contradictory. Yama Udo is green and looks wild, while Nanka Udo is white. These differences in appearance correlate with the environment in which they grow. Yama Udo consists of thick, fleshy, upright stems that average 60 to 90 centimeters long and 2 to 5 centimeters in diameter. Despite its ability to grow to large sizes, Yama Udo is still harvested seasonally because of its young and tender stems. Meanwhile, Nanka Udo is grown through the softening agriculture method, which shields them from sunlight. After 30 to 40 days, Udo is harvested when it reaches a height of about 70 centimeters. Peak harvest season is usually from December to April. Because the area planted with Udo trees is only about 1 meter high, harvesting underground is very difficult. Because their work requires constant squatting, many farmers suffer from leg and back problems. Farmers carefully cut the Udo and wrapped it to take it out of the tunnel. Another person was waiting on the ground to lift the wooden box. Timing is important after harvest because Udo will quickly turn green when exposed to sunlight. Therefore, farmers gradually switched to growing and harvesting indoors, so that Udo was less affected by the weather. The Udo growing industry in Takikawa quickly became very popular and achieved high yields of about 450 tons per year. Udo's flavor changes the image of wild vegetables. People are often concerned about the acrid taste of wild vegetables, but for Udo, it can even be eaten raw. When you bite into a piece of freshly harvested Udo, it has a crunchy sound and a faint sweetness spreads in your mouth. The fresh and refreshing taste lingers afterward. That's why this plant became Takikawa's specialty. Now let's visit Kasumigura Lake, the second largest lake in Japan, proud to have the highest lotus root production in Japan. The land along the lake is fertile and has abundant water to help lotus roots thrive. Lotus roots around Kasumigura Lake are harvested from July to March. Every year at harvest time, all lotus stems and leaves above the lake water are cut off to prevent the lotus from growing further. Lotus roots grow underground, dormant in mud, and gradually accumulate starch from summer to winter. This means that lotus roots harvested in the same lake area may have different flavors, depending on the time of harvest. Young summer lotus roots will taste as sweet as pears. Farmers continue harvesting until May, when the lotus root becomes more flexible as the sugar content turns into starch. The mud made traveling difficult, and finding lotus roots was certainly not an easy task. Farmers said it takes patience and good technique to dig out the entire lotus root. Because lotus roots may not grow straight in the soil, farmers must be gentle and not break them to be able to sell them at a good price. On average, each kilogram of lotus root costs about 2.8 USD. The lotus field is about 50 to 60 centimeters deep. The farmers had to kneel in the water, up to their chests, while they dug into the mud to find lotus roots. They use water jets to search for lotus roots by hand and go through the washing process many times. This is also a way to prevent the skin of the lotus root from being damaged. Lotus roots transported under these careful processes are not only delicious, their whiteness and appearance also add to their value. After being transported to the processing facility, the lotus roots are cut off and canned one by one. At Renkan Sankyo Day, lotus roots are harvested and shipped within 2 days of receiving farmers' orders. Besides lotus root, Japan is also the country with the most delicious mushrooms. Have you ever seen millions of shiitake mushrooms growing in the forest? Farmers carefully select oak trees that are about 10 to 20 centimeters in diameter, creating optimal growing conditions for the shiitake mushrooms to begin their growth process. Oak wood is neatly stacked, then brought to the shiitake mushroom growing area. Next, farmers will drill small holes in the wood to implant shiitake mushroom embryos. These holes are drilled about 10 to 15 centimeters apart depending on the size of the shiitake mushrooms. The mushroom embryo is implanted into the hole using a special tool to ensure the shiitake embryo is implanted at the correct position and depth. Each log will yield 2 to 4 times more shiitake mushrooms depending on hole size and weather conditions. After the shiitake mushroom embryos are transplanted into the logs, they are placed in suitable positions to wait for the shiitake mushrooms to grow to ensure a harvest. Japanese people often go into the forest and harvest each tree by hand. Harvesting is done by hand, with farmers carefully pulling the shiitake mushrooms out of the logs. They use plastic baskets to store finished products. When full, they will go to the place where the mushrooms are stored and preserved to prevent damage. The slow growth process and natural habitat of shiitake mushrooms give them a dense texture, rich flavor, and nutritional value. Growing wild shiitake mushrooms provides economic opportunities for local communities in Japan. In the southern provinces of Japan, shiitake mushrooms are grown the most in the country, accounting for 50 to 55% of total output at a relatively high price. Each year, only a limited amount of natural shiitake mushrooms can be harvested. That's why fresh shiitake mushrooms have a high price, while exported dried shiitake mushrooms are even more expensive. Upon arrival at the drying factory, the shiitake mushrooms are inspected again to remove unsuitable plants. Next, remove the soil residue and arrange them evenly together. The drying process takes place under strict control, including appropriate temperature and time to remove water from the shiitake mushrooms. At the same time, it still retains flavor and nutrients. In addition to delicious shiitake mushrooms, Japan is also famous for lingzi mushrooms. This mushroom has been used for thousands of years in traditional medicine to treat health. After felling the tree, the log rested for 2 weeks before being drilled. One log can withstand the growth of 15 Ganoderma mushrooms. The logs were inoculated with Ganoderma mushrooms and buried underground. Farmers take a long time to complete the entire process of growing and creating Ganoderma mushrooms. It takes 9 months before you can see Ganoderma mushrooms. But after a few months, when the lingzi mushroom has fully developed, it can be harvested and processed in many different ways. Wondering what makes it different from the millions of other mushrooms growing in the forest? The magic of Ganoderma mushrooms comes from the compounds locked inside its cell walls. Compared to shiitake mushrooms, Ganoderma mushrooms have a slower growth rate. Farmers have to wait 75 to 90 days to harvest. Interestingly, the yield is proportional to each 1-inch diameter of the tree. For example, a 6-inch diameter log will grow reishi mushrooms in about 6 years. This means that larger diameter logs will take longer to wait until the first harvest. As the lingzi mushroom matures, it begins to turn reddish brown and the spores fall off the cap. Mature Ganoderma mushrooms are 1 to 4 inches thick. When farmers pluck Ganoderma mushrooms, they tend to choose Ganoderma mushrooms with white bellies. Because when harvested late, if they turn brownish, they have started to decompose. Harvesting is done by holding the root with one hand and pulling up with the other. After washing with water, the Ganoderma mushrooms will be dried at temperatures below 50 degrees Celsius. Finally, we visit cabbage fields in Japan. Cabbage is a healthy food and rich in nutrients. After 70 to 115 days from planting, depending on the variety, they are ready to harvest. The base of the cabbage will be 4 to 6 inches across. The head of cabbage should be firm, compact, with tightly wrapped outer leaves. If it is not possible to harvest immediately, smaller heads of cabbage can continue to grow for the next harvest. Farmers use a knife to cut the head of cabbage from the stem, leaving a few leaves on the outside to protect the cabbage during storage. Farmers often harvest in cool weather, which can help maintain freshness and flavor. On large commercial cabbage farms, harvesting is done through automated machines attached to tractors. These machines lift the entire tree out of the soil. Cabbage moves along a conveyor belt. Farmers continue to remove damaged outer leaves. After that, the cabbage is loaded into containers and waits for transport to the warehouse for storage. Farmers are operating machinery, moving it through cabbage fields to systematically harvest. Depending on the size and capacity of the machine, it can harvest multiple rows of cabbage simultaneously, which greatly reduces the amount of labor required to harvest by hand.